Hi everyone, it's Talia from Zart, and today we're going to be creating a coral reef collage inspired by a few different artists that explore the coral reef in their own work. Here's a little example of what we'll be creating today. So as you can see, it is a coral reef, lots of simplified shapes, and we've used a bunch of different colors for this particular project as well. What we'll be using for this particular collage work is some creamy colors watercolors, but you can use any watercolor really will work. And as you can see, this is a much loved set that's leaked a bit everywhere, but that is okay. That's probably what you'll expect in your classroom. But what I'll be doing for this project is using this set of creamy colors, which are very similar to a watercolor, except when you apply them on paper, which I'll show you in just a bit, they're really, really vibrant, they're opaque, they're almost like a watercolor gouache put together. So you can see in the pan they are dried, and there's a few different sets. So we've got the macaron set, we've got the fluoro set here, which are really bright and highly pigmented, and then we've got our basic set, so you can mix colors with these as well. So for this project, if I was talking about this lesson to my class, I would link this to a few different artists that explore the coral reef in their own work. So some examples of this could be Courtney Madison. So she does some clay construction artworks that are quite large scale, and even though this is not a clay constructed artwork, you can still discuss her work. There's also artists such as Melanie Haver. So she is an Indigenous artist who is inspired by reef country in her pieces, whereas she is more of a painter or a drawer. Also, you can discuss those techniques as well as our collage techniques that we're using here. So other artists that you can explore are Matt Miller. He is also a great one to have a look at how he uses the coral reef in his own artwork as that source of inspiration. So exploring those artists, talking about their different art styles and art forms, and then bringing that back into this project. So for the start of this project, we get to explore some different techniques using watercolor paints or our creamy color paints, which work pretty much like a watercolor. So what I would do here is discuss with students some different applications for a watercolor paint. So using a sturdy cartridge paper, this one is about 130 GSM, and for collage, I feel like you can get away with using a cartridge paper that is slightly thinner than what you might do with a watercolor painting, just because we can flatten out those papers later on between drying times to get them nice and flat. It doesn't really matter if the paper buckles a little bit as we're exploring these techniques, because we can work with that later on. So with a paintbrush, a nice soft paintbrush and a pot of water, what I would do is get my students to talk about different ways that we can apply watercolor. So you might try a wet on dry technique. So you do need a bit of water to activate these creamy colors. So a wet on dry, my brush is wet, whereas my paper is dry. See how that works with your creamy colors. And you can also blend more than one color together, but you might want to start off, especially with junior grades, just exploring how one color will go on a piece of paper. You can explore a wet on wet technique. So you wet your paper with your brush. You don't need to overly soak it. And then we can pick up another color, like this lovely blue, with our wet brush and apply that over the top. And you can see how those colors are moving by themselves on the wet paper. And that creates a really nice effect. So that is our wet on wet. And then you might explore something like our dry brush. So with our dry brush, you want a dry brush. So you do need a little bit of water just to activate those watercolors. So activate that a little bit, and then on a piece of spare paper, just get some of that moisture off your brush. Grab a little bit more pigment. You can see as I'm brushing on that paper, it's quite dry. And then over your actual testing piece of paper, just use that dry brush with a little bit of pigment, and you get some really lovely texture. Now with your students, you could explore blending colors. So depending on what level that your students are at, they may have had already some experience in doing this kind of thing, whereas some students who are new to watercolor or painting techniques in general, they may not be as accustomed. So you might need to walk them through the steps, or they might be able just to explore by themselves. So you can see that blue and that green is merging really nicely. So this could be a whole lesson of work. So what I'm going to do now is explore a few more techniques on my paper. I might layer them, I might use a different size brush and see how these creamy colours apply. Okay, so once you've had a bit of a play with those watercolor techniques, as you can see, I've tried a few different ones like layering two colors, one over the top of each other, using different size brushes to create those dots. I've pressed on some tissue onto our wet creamy colors to give you that really beautiful texture, so the dabbing of the tissue on there, and you can just explore some different shapes, different patterns. You can draw your inspiration from the coral reef, maybe see some patterns in there. Even the colors that you choose, while I'm working only with this one set, maybe you want to give your students a whole range of colors that they can explore and incorporate that into their work depending on what they see in source images or images from artists, so they can incorporate their own colors and make their choices. So from here, what I would do is make larger sheets of paper for the students to use in their own collage. So I'm going to move this to the side because it is wet and I'll put my hand in it. So here I've got 2 sheets of paper on A3. I've done a little bit of exploration and I might work back over the top of this as I'm creating my shapes. But what's important here is to have enough paper to use. This could be a collaborative kind of work where the students make a whole range of papers as a class. They spend a whole lesson on this, and then that can just go into a communal pile for the next lesson. When the students want to create their collage, they can use papers made by anyone, doesn't matter who. But what's important is you do want to have your background pieces, so that might be the ocean, so blue for the ocean, and your sand, so that nice grainy kind of creamy yellowy color, however you want to describe it, but you do want to have at least those 2 colors to differentiate your ocean and your sand in that seascape, and then just some really nice interesting colors to go along with that. So what I would do from here is choose what kind of shape I want to work with. So I've been toing and froing. I didn't want to do it on a standard A4 because that's a little bit boring. And I saw we've got these circle papers, and I thought this could be an interesting way to display my work. With your students, you can discuss what kind of shapes they want to use for displaying, because you can go larger scale, smaller scale, you can go round, triangle. Let them have a choice and you can discuss those exhibiting options with your students. So when you've created your collage papers, they've dried, you've got the shape that you want to display your work on, what we're going to do is cut out our background pieces and then stick them onto our base shape. So ocean background, sand. It's a bit hard to cut a circle, so what I'm going to do is cut this out and then cut around my circle once I've stuck that on. So I'm going to get to cutting now. Here we go, looks like an ocean already, nearly. So we've got our background down, now we get to do the fun part and cut all of our shapes. So for this part of the process, you might want to discuss with your students how you can break down a complex shape like you might see in a coral reef into something that's really simple. Now to me, these are really Matisse looking shapes, but again, you can explore different artists and discuss how you might make a shape more simple. You can look at photos of a coral reef and do some little drawing exercises to get your students used to working with those shapes. So what I would do is kind of imagine from my piece of coloured paper what shapes I want to incorporate and where. So my rocks over here, my large shapes, might be a darker colour, and then over the top of that I might create some of my lighter colours. So my coral reef shapes might be more of these browny tones, and I might add some more shape actually, because this might look very similar to my ocean background, so I might include some brighter pinks into that section. So you can keep working over your paper if you want to, even if it's dry. Work over it again. It shouldn't take too long to dry if you just do like a really thin coat of watercolor paint over the top and don't completely soak it. Should be okay to work with in the same lesson. So what I would do is you can chop down this paper into the sections. Chop, chop, chop. And then you can draw on the other side the shape of your rocks or your whatever's in the ocean that you see. For me at the moment, I am going to draw in those little rock type formations at the bottom of the sea. So draw them in, you know, something rough. Doesn't have to be precise or perfect. And now I'll cut those out and see how they look on my background. Now what you might notice with your students, if they're in a rush, and who isn't in a rush these days, their cutting might be a little bit when they first chop it off. Even my cutting's a little bit So I would definitely recommend when your students have cut out a piece from a larger piece, just have a look at it and clean up those edges to make them a little bit nicer. Now what you might notice is that we are working on a circle. If you were working on that square piece of paper, then the edge of your rock or whatever shape you've made will come up nicely against that straight line, whereas on the circle it does not come up nicely. So what I tend to do when I'm creating my collages is cut all of my pieces, lay them down, get a gauge of where everything sits, and then glue them down after. So what I would do is get all of my pieces together, glue them down, and then I can chop around that outside to fit that circle shape. So bear with me in probably fast forward speed. I'm going to go ahead, draw the shapes of my coral reef on the back of my hand painted papers and then cut them out. Then we'll come back and have a look at how our composition is looking after that. Okay, so now I've cut out all of my little pieces. Now, as I cut out, I tend to place things where I think they should go, which is absolutely fine, except if you're going from one lesson to the next and you have to pack everything away before you stick it down, which is what you might want to do with your students, because what I find sometimes is when I place something down and I look at it and think, yeah, that looks nice, I really never take it all away and then start again, because, you know, once it's there, it's there. But what might help your students is take everything away, place it back, and maybe even do that a few times to find the right composition. So what I would do here is grab my pieces, starting from my largest pieces, and then placing more over the top. So maybe going from my foreground and then just kind of arranging things from things that are large, things that are small, creating those layers in your work. So you might want to have some shapes behind other shapes, and you can alter your shapes as well. So you can see some of these have very sharp lines, which I might cut down. So I'm going to have a bit of a play. I'm going to place things, see how they look, take them away, put them back, and hopefully we'll have a beautiful composition by the time I'm done fiddling, but we'll have a look once I've done placing my composition. Okay, am I happy with it? No, but I never will be. So sometimes it's about drawing that line in the sand, because there's sand there. Sometimes it's about stopping and quitting before you go too far. So I think this is the composition I'll go with. Your students might be playing quite a lot with it. And if you want to dedicate a lesson to how you present it, how the composition works, how you create layers, then absolutely go for it. But if you don't have time for that, then you might need to set time limits on how much you move around things. So this is a tricky part, because if you're happy with that composition and you absolutely love it and don't want anything to change, you're going to have to move things around, and in that things will change just by having to paste things down. So I'm going to gently move some things away so I can paste down some of those larger shapes. So what I'm going to do here is just have a little bit of glue so I can still tuck things underneath these larger shapes, and they're going to come off the edge of the page a little bit as well, but I can trim those off later on. So all I'm going to do now is use my glue stick, apply some glue, and get everything stuck down. Okay, now everything is stuck down, and if you notice, when I was sticking things down, I am an absolute mess, which is what your students will be, so I'm just being realistic. So something that I found works really well, because you kind of get glue everywhere, especially when you're working with little pieces of collage paper that are this small. I like to have a spare piece of paper or a placemat paper like we have here, and flip your collage piece upside down, apply the glue to the back, and just really liberally spread it all over the paper. I do that because when you're really, finicky about trying to get the glue all around the edges and fit things exactly where they're meant to go glue-wise, half your things come off the paper and they don't stick very well. So by being okay with applying the glue onto the paper underneath, you can get a really nice stick. Now, I showed you that, but I don't actually want to use this one. This one doesn't fit anywhere, so I'm going to just put that over to the side. It's nice to be able to edit things as you're putting your collage together. So even maybe having some watercolor paint still accessible for your students if they want to add some color in certain places. Now, as I mentioned, we've got some overlap here just of those larger shapes. Trim them off, follow around that circular piece of paper that you had. Even if you wanted to have some of these collage pieces, now I'm going to use you as an example, but I'm not going to use you. You can have some pieces coming off over the edge. Again, that discussion about how you present or exhibit your artworks and how that might impact the overall way that you display your work. That can be something you incorporate in your discussion. But otherwise, we've got our coral reef collage. If you wanted your students to have different papers to present their work on, different shapes, you can discuss the difference in how you might display this artwork as a group. How does a circle compare to working on your standard A4 sheet of paper? Have some students gone larger scale? Have they gone smaller scale? What kind of colors have you used? Maybe you are using this creamy colors watercolor set, but you give each table or each student a different set to work with and those specific colors to work with. Or maybe you give them every color, but that's definitely something that you can discuss in the work. But otherwise, that is our coral reef collage. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.